All right, let's get into a more elaborate example. Here in number 58, I see that my parent function is cosine x. So my period will have the same shape as the basic cosine curve. Another thing you want to keep in mind is just like last unit, if you have a coefficient in front of your x, you need to factor it out like a GCF and look at it as its own separate transformation. So this is -3 cosine. I'm going to open up brackets. Factoring out 6, that leaves x plus pi over 6. So now let's analyze this function for its transformations. First, the negative in front means that we will reflect across the x-axis. This 3 means that we have an amplitude of 3. The 6 helps me figure out my period, which is the length of one curve, and that's going to be 2 pi over 6, or pi over 3. And then adding pi over 6 means we shift left pi over 6 units. Now that we have these pieces, we can start to sketch. But sometimes when we have all these fractions with unlike denominators, it can make our life a little bit more hectic. So let me show you some strategies for finding certain parts of the curve. So the first thing we want to look for is the endpoints of the first period. So normally we start at 0, but since we're shifting to the left pi over 6, that means we're going to subtract pi over 6. So that means we're going to start at negative pi over 6. Now, ending, normally with our period of pi over 3, we would end at pi over 3. But since we're shifting left from that, we're going to subtract pi over 6. Now, to subtract these two fractions, I need common denominators. 2 pi over 6 minus pi over 6 is pi over 6. So that means I'm going to start at negative pi over 6 and end at pi over 6 to have my full period of pi over 3. So let me go ahead and start to create my axis then. Actually, give myself a little more space. Like that. Okay. So we know we're starting at negative pi over 6, and we're ending at pi over 6. Now to split this in half, that's pretty easy. We split in half here at 0, and then between 0 and pi over 6, that splits to be pi over 12, and this half will also be negative pi over 12. Now my amplitude tells me how high up and down I should go, 3 and -3. Now, if I want to sketch my first period, normally cosine starts up here at the top. But since we're reflecting across the x-axis, we're actually going to start down here at negative pi over 6, -3. Then I'll hit up to 0 at negative pi over 12, hit my maximum here at 3, go back down to another 0, and then I'll end my first period at pi over 6, -3. And here is my cosine curve. Beautiful. Now I need to get my second period. So for the end of my second period, I'm going to start with where I just ended, which is pi over 6, and I'm going to add my period, pi over 3. So that is pi over 6 plus 2 pi over 6, which is 3 pi over 6, or pi over 2. So that means here I'm going to go over to pi over 2. Now I need to split these into halves. Now we can find my first midpoint here. So that midpoint I get by doing pi over 6 plus pi over 2 divided by 2, which is going to be, what is that? 4 pi over 6 over 2, which is 4 pi over 12 pi over 3. So this is pi over 3. Now I need to find that second quarter period, or the first quarter period here. So that first quarter is pi over 6 plus pi over 3 divided by 2, which is going to be 3 pi over 6 over 2, which is 3 pi over 12 pi over 4. And now for that 3/4, I'm going to call it third quarter, right? I need to find the midpoint of pi over 3 and pi over 2. So that's pi over 3 plus pi over 2 divided by 2. So that's 2 plus 3, 5 pi over 6 over 2, or 5 pi over 12. And remember, we can now sketch our curve following the same pattern. I'm going to come up to my 0 here to a maximum value of pi over 3, 3, back down to a 0, and back down here to pi over 2, negative 3. And this is the second period of that cosine curve.